We live in a world that seems to have ever increasing demands upon us regarding the quality of the things that we do and we present, whether that's in work, school, just daily life. And more, we find that with things like social media, everybody's competing to be more and more perfect. There's the word that we sometimes throw out there. But the reality is, perfect means without flaw, without any kind of missing pieces. And is that even achievable? Is that something we should be striving for? Are there other concepts that are more realistic? Well, we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about it with an expert on the subject. So put on the brakes, grab a cup of coffee, and join the conversation because it's time for Coffee Breaks with Steve. Well, welcome to Coffee Breaks with Steve. I'm Steve Glavin, and this is the show where we come together around our virtual coffee table each week and join the conversation to chat about interesting topics with amazing guests. If you're joining us for the first time today, welcome. And if you've been with us before, welcome back. Just want to say hello. I see Shalane is on here. Jerry is on here. Good morning to both of you. And Shalane has a very definite good morning. I'll take that. We need a good morning. How is everybody doing? As you tune in today, make sure you do say hi in the chat so that we know that you're here and engage in the conversation, particularly once we bring our guest in and start talking about this fascinating and I think important topic. So, yeah, just want to see how everybody's doing as you're checking in today. Everybody doing okay? How's your June going? We're actually more than halfway through the month of June. We're like three quarters of the way. This is the 21st, which means next week is more or less the end. Dustin's here too. Dustin's here. It's good to know that Dustin's here is here. No, Dustin's here. Okay, whatever. Good to have you here too, Dustin. I knew the topic was going to require a lot of coffee today. I didn't necessarily know that my talking was going to require that much, but we'll do it. All right, listen, this is going to be, we very often bring our guests on in a pre-recorded segment. And with that, we have a great opportunity to kind of edit ahead of time. And sometimes I regret even having to edit because we do that so often. We're doing our editing for the sake of time. And to do that, we have to cut out some comments or points that a guest might make that I'd really love to leave in there, but we just can't fit it all sometimes into a 45-minute episode. So we're doing a couple of things today. First of all, our guest is going to be joining us live, not pre-recorded. So we're going to be having a spontaneous conversation about this topic of the perfection trap. The other thing is, if you have been paying close attention to our promos all week, that we listed this as being a 9:30 to 10:30 show. I don't know that we'll go a full hour today, but I wanted to make sure that we left enough time in today's show to not cut short this conversation. And when we are talking live, we don't have the option to pre-record, to pre-edit as we do with a recording. So we're just going to allow for that to happen. I do want to share some things before we get into our topic, our sweet and savory, and let you know some things that were on my list of fun. And so, Shalane, here's the charcuterie for you. But this was actually not this coming week, it was yesterday. Did you know that yesterday was officially the first day of summer, the summer solstice in North America? The interesting thing that you probably know, but I'm a trivia nerd, is that in the southern hemisphere, yesterday was the first day of winter. So in places like South America, Australia, Africa, parts of Asia, it's now officially winter there. And it's now officially summer here. What I find interesting is we've had pretty warm weather the last couple of weeks. And now today, in the first full day of summer, we're here in Spokane having some drizzle and rain, and it's cooler, which is fine. It helps. It was windy the last couple of days here. We already had the start of some wildfires in the area. So getting some rain and a little bit of calmness it's still breezy, but it's rainy. And the moisture will probably help us keep the fire danger away at least a little bit longer. But yes, we're now officially into summer. Also, did you know that today is National Selfie Day? Carol refers to me as the master of selfies. If we're anywhere, if we're in a family event, if we're at a business event, at any event, I'm into doing the selfies. And in fact, last year, Shalane will recall this, that last year, she and I accompanied her on a trip to Las Vegas last summer. And on our final day there, we actually visited something called the Selfie Museum, or the Museum of Selfies in Las Vegas. And there were, throughout this museum, there were some exhibits, but it was mostly you pay to get in, and then every little cubby hole in this place was another opportunity to do selfies with some kind of a backdrop and to kind of create interesting effects with your selfies, which Shalane and I were not shy about doing. I'm not bringing any more of the pictures here, but just a reminder to Shalane that we did that. And I do have all of those photos. I was going to say it's blackmail, but I know that you wouldn't care if I displayed them anyway, Shalane. But anyway, that's what it is today. So maybe take an opportunity today to take a selfie and put it up online. In fact, after the show today, we will put something up on the Coffee Breaks with Steve Facebook page, reminding people that it's National Selfie Day and asking people to add their selfies to the comments on there. How's that? Won't that be fun? Won't that be exciting and fun? We have one birthday this week that I wanted to give a shout out to. Nilu Nuri, a friend, a former colleague in work situations, and a guest on this show in the past, is celebrating a birthday this week on Friday, on the 27th. So a shout out and a happy birthday to Nilu. Do you have a special day this week? Let us know that in the chat. Maybe I should have known about it, but I didn't, or maybe you just never told me. And I need to know that you have a special day. We need to know that you have a special day this week, a birthday, an anniversary, a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah, a graduation. This is the season for it. You have a wedding. You got married this week, or you're getting married this week, and you want us to celebrate with you. Let us know that in the chat. If you have a special day, any of the above or others, coming up maybe in July, in August, sometime later this year, you can send us an email at cbwsteve@comcast.net. We'll make sure that we get it on our calendar. And then if for some reason we miss it when it does come up, you can publicly shame me because you sent it to me and I said I'd put it on the calendar. But let us know about those so that we can go ahead and celebrate with you. All right, listen, I want to introduce our guest. I want to get to our conversation because this is one I've really been looking forward to. And the guest and I have been talking about doing this one for a little while. Lisa Steele's been with us before, but I want to tell you a little bit about her in case you're joining and seeing her on the show for the first time. But Lisa is a highly accomplished, results-oriented leader in simulation-based education with more than 13 years of experience directing and expanding simulation centers within academic healthcare settings. She's the Assistant Provost, Office of Experiential Learning at Pacific Northwest University of Health Sciences in Yakima, Washington. leading simulation-based education for more than 850 students across 10 plus programs. And by the way, this is an introduction and a bio that I'm going to need a lot of coffee and take a lot of breaths for. Lisa serves on the Association of Standardized Patient Educators Board of Directors as Online Learning Resources Committee Chair. Her scholarly contributions include developing pre-OSCE, which is objective structured clinical examination content, and standardized patient certification programs, enhancing learner outcomes and standardized patient fidelity. She's conducted research and made presentations at national conferences, including American Association of Colleges of Osteopathic Medicine, Association of Standardized Patient Educators, and the Society for Simulation in Healthcare. Yes, I'm going to do this. Currently completing her doctorate of business administration and organizational leadership, and with a master's degree, public health in health education. I'm proud and looking quite forward to a great conversation with Lisa Steele. Lisa, welcome back to Coffee Breaks with Steve. Good to have you here. Uh-oh, we're mute at the moment. Make sure you're disenmutified, or I'll see if I can. There we go.
It's a perfect way to start off perfectionism.
You did that on purpose. We're just going to say you did that on purpose to show this. This is an interesting topic, and sharing some of your credentials and your background, I think it's important to say that while much of what we presented there has to do with your work in patient simulation in the university setting, your background and your expertise covers a lot of different areas. We talked about the organizational leadership, and that is one of the areas where we have to address and sometimes dispel concepts of perfection, right?
Absolutely. And it's funny because I think about just listening to you talk through my bio and having to take a drink of coffee in the middle. It shows I'm a recovering perfectionist myself.
Yeah.
You have to come to a point where you realize you're on a train and it's going to go the direction it's going to go. And sometimes there's a fork in the train tracks and it's going to take you a different pathway. But many of the things that I've achieved in my past have been a result of learning to let that perfectionism go. When you think about it in a business setting, the biggest part of my job, especially at this point, is navigating people, right? And people can bring their own levels of challenge to every workplace and every dynamic. So if you're navigating people, you're probably navigating perfectionism, even if it's an internal challenge they're dealing with.
The thing about perfectionism, I mentioned in the intro that if you think about what the term or the word perfection means, it means something completely without flaw, without error, without any kind. It has to be perfect. But we sometimes, I think, mistakenly apply the word perfection when we really mean other things. And, for instance, whether it's the workplace, whether it's school, I think school has become another area where there is so much of a push for achievement that it becomes overachievement. And, you run into situations. I know I was fortunate growing up. This wasn't quite the case for me, but I've known of families where if a student comes home with a report card that has anything other than straight A's, they're actually punished. They're actually belittled for not having had what a parent would look at as being a perfect record. We run into that in the job situations when we're having a performance evaluation that either we are presented with something that says you had some issues here, or we ourselves get very discouraged if we receive a performance evaluation that has any kind of critique feedback on it. And I'm just wondering about your thoughts about a couple of those areas, both the school and the work situations, where you think that comes from and how we begin dealing with that in a more positive way.
Yeah, so interestingly, I think that our internal feel, right, is that we're going to be judged. We're going to be looked down upon. We're going to be seen as less than. But I very rarely, and when I ask people, I say this a lot, put the shoe on the other foot. If you were working with somebody else and you were assessing their performance, would you have the same harsh critique that you're giving as a self-performance review? And it's very rare that that's the case, right? So I do think that a lot of it comes more internal, but what we hear about is the external. Because the examples you just gave there were both, parents being upset about student grades. I have a 16-year-old right now that she comes home and crucifies herself daily about not performing well enough. And I can tell you it's not coming from, she worries so much about, I'm not adhering to the expectations that you have of me. Just had this work conversation literally a couple days ago, might have been yesterday. Honestly, it's been a blur this week, but had a conversation with a colleague who the big concern was not performing to my expectations. But I think one thing you need to challenge is it really that person's expectations, or is it your own that you're disappointing?
Right.
And I think sometimes it's coming from ourselves. There are the cases, to be fair, there are the cases where, a parent really wants to push you to do better, or a colleague or anybody on the home front in the school system. They see a potential in somebody. And so when you're not performing to your full potential, there's reprimand, right? But I think that we have shifted and we have to find a balance. You'll hear me talk a lot about balance. There's a need to have that reinforcement of expectation, accountability. I'll talk accountability a lot. And there's the other side of that, of recognizing that sometimes the reason someone's not being able to achieve the expectation is where you need to focus. So you'll hear me talk about stop focusing on the branches, let's find the root. Is the root of the problem really their lack of performance, or is the root of the problem a personal situation at home? Is the root of the problem a feeling of deficit internally that I can't perform at the level that someone expects of me?
Yeah.
So,
We've talked about, when you were here before, one of the topics that we covered was the failure syndrome, which goes hand in hand with this, doesn't it? And I wonder as well if, because the whole idea of trying to replace perfectionism as a goal is to set different internal, and where we have the control to do so, external standards and
right.
goals. And I mean, excellence is a good replacement for perfectionism if indeed we define excellence. There still need to be some definitions, and in some cases metrics, to say, what do we agree on as being excellent? And if we feel like we've achieved, do we ever achieve even excellence? Can that become in and of itself a trap if we feel like that's a constantly moving target? And how do we address working toward excellence? Because now we're talking about something that you mentioned, the train going down the track, and I think about movement and progress as part of this too.
I think that you just hit the nail on the head. So it's not, we keep setting it as this end target, right? An outcome. But maybe it's not the outcome, it's the journey.
Mm.
Maybe it's the progress. Maybe it's the success towards. And you brought up another point with regards to a work environment, right? As soon as we get a negative evaluation, we feel like, oh my God, the world's ended. No, it's just a negative evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes I've actually told my team frequently, that negative evaluation, especially if I'm able to point to a lack of resource, a lack of structure, a lack of support, that negative outcome actually gives me what I need as a supervisor, as an upper leadership person, to move that needle.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not always a direct reflection, but it just feels really uncomfortable, right? But maybe the shift isn't the perfectionism of the end goal. It's asking yourself the question, have I given my best that I'm capable of to aim towards the North Star, right? There is
Yeah.
always a North Star. And it's the same thing I share with people, even if you think about, is this where I fit? How many of us have had that moment where we go, gosh, is this really where I belong? Many, all, I would challenge. And when you look at that North Star of where maybe a company is headed, and maybe your North Star is not the same,
Yeah.
well, that doesn't mean you failed. That just means you've diverted in your track. So get off that train. Stop trying to kill yourself going down that train, aiming for perfectionism. And maybe you need to get off the train and head to a different direction.
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. That's very relevant because I was having that exact conversation with someone within the last day or two, and that can be tough too because it's that sense of the reality is when you do that, you're changing trains, but sometimes our own feeling in going into that is that we're derailing, and that's never comfortable, right? Change sometimes is uncomfortable. I also wonder, Lisa, where this comes in, that I know this is true for me, that when I've gotten into some of those situations, and you said something I think was very relevant, and that is that sometimes we begin a process, we begin within a setting, and everybody's got the same North Star, but that can change over time from either side. And in fact, I think it frequently does. And it doesn't always mean we need to change trains. Sometimes it's just a matter of recognizing those things enough to open the communication and maybe come to a new understanding, and maybe you can both agree on that new North Star. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a separation of purpose. It can
Right?
be a redefinition, but it does require regular communication so that hopefully it doesn't come as a surprise. I know you've encountered that in the workplace, those differences between times that you and member of your staff, maybe you thought they were on the same path that you were, or they thought you were on the same path they were, and it wasn't until a certain conversation takes place that everybody gets that aha moment. And then what do you do with that? You have to reevaluate everything in order to determine, are we still on the same trajectory
Right?
here? But I also think one of the things that I know has happened to me in the past is that you get into those situations and you're afraid to address it because you start playing the old tapes, those situations where it didn't go well, and you face that imposter syndrome thing about, okay, maybe it's me, maybe I'm just not good enough. And so then we become a little bit, I think, insecure about the vulnerability of addressing that. And I just like to get some perspective on you in situations where you specifically, I mean, you've been on both sides of it, where you've had to go to someone who was higher up on the ladder than you potentially and said, look, I think we're going two different directions here. Can we talk about this and how that feels? But also being the person in the supervisory, managerial director role when somebody comes to you, or you may sense that something needs to be addressed, but maybe they're afraid to come to you,
Right.
and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think you hit one of the key words that you brought up was vulnerability. And I think that is the place that most people don't like operating. It's
Mm-hmm.
hard to be vulnerable. So how do you navigate that? I think it comes with safety. And I love the concept of psychological safety, and I think that it needs to be coupled with brave spaces. And if you read the literature on both, you're going to see where we really swung the pendulum to the left and said, let's put everybody in a safe bubble. Well, that prevents conversation. That prevents tackling the tough conversations, having the honest conversations, being able to agree to disagree. Rarely are you going to have as good of an outcome if you are only surrounding yourself with people that are like minded, because you're all like minded for a reason. But if you shift to brave spaces, right, that's the willingness to step out, to say, you know what, I have enough safety in the environment I'm in that I'm going to speak up. So I think part of it, if you think from a leader standpoint, there is a responsibility on my shoulders, on any leader's shoulders, to create that safety, to create that environment. And there are plenty of times that I have had to push a little and get someone to have that conversation they're not ready to have. It comes back to, I mean, for lack of a better term, Emotional intelligence is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Being able to read the room is a thing. Some people have that skill, others do not. I think you can develop it, but it takes, again, vulnerability. I can't think of any skill that most people develop. There's natural talent, there's raw talent, but true skill comes from failure, right? That's that tie
Right.
back into failure. And failure allows us to step forward into success if we're willing to embrace the vulnerability and the discomfort of growth. So that's what I do on me being a leader side, right? It's being able to prepare that environment and give that environment. And if I can't encourage one to have self accountability, then I have to hold accountability. And
Mm.
that's another place that for a leader is sometimes not comfortable, but that's that balance, right?
Yeah.
I've had many situations, and many of my staff have had situations where they have realized and recognized the value and the power of holding someone accountable. Giving people the guardrails actually helps them succeed in ways that you don't realize
Yeah.
if you have never given them those guardrails. As a employee having to step up, right? Because there's the flip side, and whether that be me as an employee stepping forward, I rarely have the comfort of being able to step forward and know that what I'm going to say is going to be well received. But I do have the luxury of I'm okay with that. I'm okay with that. And I think that comes from a lot of internal self work. And that's some work that a lot of people don't want to do. It really ties in. I was at the ASPE conference, Association of SP Educators, in Montreal recently, and I presented several times on various topics. But the theme that kept coming forward is there's a lack of comfort of challenging the norm, of stepping into someone's full role and potential, of stepping to their full scope. And I've seen this in my field and in my career constantly. And my answer is I want to empower everybody to, I literally am the person that breaks the wall down and uses the brick from the wall to lay the pavement so someone else can walk behind, right? That's what I think of every time I climb that ladder and I push on those parts that aren't comfortable. And so because my center is really being able to pave that way for other people, that discomfort I feel in the moment is irrelevant because I know I'm doing it for good reason. But what I found is people lack identity and
Mm-hmm.
self-identity, confidence. That imposter syndrome comes in here. How do you teach someone to value the identity they have? How do you teach someone to identify who they are? And so this has become my new focal point, maybe a talk for the future, but I really am starting to step into that space of identity formation and, getting comfortable in the discomfort, being comfortable in the vulnerability, recognizing that if you have a negative evaluation, it's not a negative evaluation unless you tell yourself it is. It's an
Yeah.
opportunity for growth. It's an opportunity to step forward.
You were talking about identity, and it reminded me of a phrase that one of my mentors shared years ago, and it was asking the question, do you get your who from your do or your do from your who? Right?
Mm-hmm.
In other words, do you seek your identity? And I don't know, we've said for years that this is more of a male trait, but I don't know in modern times if this is restricted to one gender or not. The idea that so many men, and I saw this during my career, that so many men get their identity from success in their careers. That I would go to places and you'd ask somebody about themselves, and before they would, especially men, before they would tell you anything about their life, they would start telling you about their job and about their role and their position and their responsibilities. And you could see where that was very much tied to their sense of acceptance and identity. And I know that was one that I had to learn to fight a lot.
That was, and the interesting part of that is the number of, and I do believe this is a more masculine trait. Um, I think that it happens on both sides and it happens differently. So on the male side, or someone whose primary role or purpose is breadwinning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Male, female, doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
You often are going to define your success based on how much money you bring in the door. And that's because that's what is your livelihood.
Right.
The number of men that I have had feel uncomfortable with, well, how am I going to introduce myself? And especially me being in the position that I'm in, having a man have his own internal strength to stand on his own 2 feet and be who he is, standing alongside me, that gets really challenging for men if a woman is really successful. That is a thing. I've seen it many times. For women, I think that the identity formation really gets stuck in whatever their primary duties are. So if you have a stay-at-home mom that is choosing motherhood, I love the comment, Shalane, is choosing motherhood, they sometimes lose focus of what else they are beyond that mother, right?
Yeah,
And
that's
the
right.
reality is they can be a mother, and the words that'll tick me off pretty quick, just a mom. No, there's no
No.
just a mom in this. You are a mom, and you get the best job in the world. And I can say this as a woman who has had an amazing dynamic career and raised 2 kids pretty much on my own. If I could have done it different, I would have been just a mom, because those kids deserve the world from me, and I had to split my focus as a result. But I think regardless of the structure, because we just went from one extreme to the other, you're going to define yourself based on societal standards of what is
Right.
acceptable. And quite
Right.
frankly, I'm not one to really abide by societal standards in most senses. So I just step forward in what's right in my heart. But how do you give someone that power and strength of being so confident in their own identity that even if they're stepping against the society, the status quo, the norms, the company, whatever it is, they're confident enough to step there? Because while I'd love to say it is the responsibility of those higher up to give psychological safety, that's not real. And it's not going to happen everywhere. So now how do we empower the other side of that, which is stepping out into my own strength and my self-identity?
You mentioned, societal standards and expectations, and a part of that also has to do with cultural expectations. There are some cultures that put a higher degree of expectation on what we could define as perfection. I'm not going to single out cultures, but we know that there are some around the world where meeting a very, very, very high level is part of the expectation through childhood and into careers. And it can lead to very serious mental and emotional repercussions along the way. And so I think that's, we have to take those things into consideration. I also wonder whether it's in the workplace, in school, in family situations, where does competition impact all of this?
I think competition is definitely an individualist trait. I have a whole lot of competition. It's actually funny. I usually lead this with saying I'm not a competitive person, and most people look at me with my career and they're like, yeah, right. But I have absolutely no interest in competing with somebody. Go back to that, example I used. I want to bust the wall down, not for my success, but for your ability to walk through that wall, because I know I can withstand the pressures that are going to push back when I'm there. I have a whole lot of internal competitiveness, and I said I was a recovering perfectionist. So it took being in medical school for me to realize that a pass is a pass and an A didn't put me anywhere different. And I was raising a child on my own at the time, and I had to step back and go, okay, hold on. Is that A really worth it? And I will tell you, my parents never put those expectations on me. I did not feel that I had to have a straight A type report card. It 100% came from inside of me for whatever reason. So yes, it can come from outside and it can come from inside. But I think that, again, if you're able to find where you want to compete and why, you need your why, right? In that identity formation, it's the why story. Why do I want to bust this wall down? And do I really understand what's on the other side of the wall? because sometimes we get so stuck in the competition of success that we bust through the wall without recognizing the damage that's potentially coming from breaking a
Right.
structure that wasn't ready to break.
Right.
And so that's a skill set that I know I have where, if I had to choose, chess would be my game because I'm seeing, the lay of the land on various boards. And that train on the tracks concept, I'm okay with derailing because I'm jumping to the next chessboard and playing a different game. I already see that next step. But how do you teach people that level of strategy or adaptability, flexibility? And I think that goes to the piece of perfectionism. When I see everything has pros and cons, right?
Right.
Excellence is definitely a pro of what perfectionism is. But the negative, the dark side of that is, you get so stuck in the rut. Some people, and I'm sure many of you can relate to this, just taking the first step is the most challenging. And if you're stuck in a perfectionist mindset, you don't want to make that step until you're confident of what that step is, whether it's confidence in the security of it, confidence in the product that you're putting out, confidence in and the reality is, if you're no longer defined by the product, by the
Yeah.
output, by the
Yeah.
outcome, then you're not going to be as fearful of the ramifications of it.
Right. You were talking about the external and the internal, and a couple of my own experiences came to mind. I can recall in school, this was only 1 year that I recall in junior high. I had one teacher, excellent teachers, and actually one of my favorite all-time teachers. But he used, and I'm not sure if this methodology is still exercised in education as much, but he was very much a proponent of grading on a curve. And so, regardless of what the exam was or what the assignment was, there was always this bell curve. And based on the number of students in the class, there were going to be so many that were going to get an A for that assignment, so many that were going to get a B, and so many that were going to get a C. And if anybody actually failed, they failed. But there was always this sense, I remember even at that time, I was fairly young, thinking to myself, so what if everybody gets 100% on the test? How do you deal with that? Well, then, and this happens in the workplace sometimes with situations where it's like, look, we're going to we have this much of an ability to give raises this year. And so out of your staff, you're going to have to pick the top X number of people who are going to get so many people are going to get a 5% raise, and then so many people are only going to get a 3% and then a 1%. And you have to make that decision based on your evaluation of performance. And if they're all high performers, you still have to come up with some methodology of doing that. I also, in coming back to the competition thing, I can remember working for bosses who would deliberately try to play employees against each other. It happens a lot in sales environments where everybody is sort of competing for being in that top dog in the sales environment. And I have seen in those situations, I've seen it in family too. I had one relative who used to, every time we got together, the relative had kids about the same age as we were, would always want to check to see, brag about the grades their kids were getting and how did that compare to the grades we were getting, and even stand us up back to back to see who was taller. It was sort of this, there was always some form of competition. And I never really looked at that one. In fact, I didn't ever look at most of them as being some impetus for me to try to gain perfection. It was almost like I internally rolled my eyes and thought, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And, in some of those situations, it potentially made me look in certain work situations like maybe I didn't care to meet the expectations. But that's when you come back to one of those early points we were talking about. When are you not aiming for the same North Star? If that is a key cultural criteria for success within the organization, and that to me is something that's completely outside of the realm of what I'm going to aim for, then that's probably not a good fit for me.
Probably. And that is a piece that I always say is you have to find your fit. And it doesn't make you right, me right, the other person right. Or wrong.
Correct.
It just is your fit, right? I believe, and I stand pretty strongly on this, I believe that people that encourage competition or are competitive with external people have a lack of confidence. I feel that it is showboating. Um, it is very rarely is it a positive environment. Um, it's interesting to me when people choose to compare, and especially I love your example about family because it happens so often. That goes back to that piece of my identity is only what my children are because I've lost who I am beyond my children, right? I see that a lot when a person is identifying solely with their role as a mother as opposed to all of the other things that they still do, or a father and all of the other things they still do. In a workplace, I see the same thing. A boss that is effective, a leader that is effective, they're
Mm-hmm.
not going to need to pit their people against one another because a shared goal is going to be far more effective than a competitive goal. But
Yeah.
if you can, the quickest way to encourage people to improve their performance is making them pit one another against one another. But the result is you're going to have increased burnout. You're going to have people stall. You're going to have people not be able to continue maintaining that pace. You're going to have that piece where eventually you're going to stop, right? And you're just
Right.
not going to go down that path. I did see a question in the chat from Chelan, a couple now. One was, how do I teach people to do what I do? And I got to tell you, full transparency, Chelan works with me. She has been my greatest encouragement to be able to learn how to do this. Because when I do something, she's the one that makes me break it down and figure out why the heck did I move when I just moved. And I have never been asked those questions in my past where normally it's just moved to the next thing. She really makes me break it down and say, well, here's what I did, and here's why I did it, and here's how I did it. So when I think about how do I teach people to have that internal confidence, I think it's giving them the building blocks to develop a self identity, which, we laugh all the time. And you mentioned I'm almost, done with that doctorate that's kicking my rear right now. But I will probably be done with my doctorate by the end of July. Thank heavens. And I am looking forward to that day. And then I can start writing books and I can start
Mm-hmm.
doing the things I enjoy doing,
Mm-hmm.
like how do you develop a self identity? How do you find your confidence and your grit within your own existence? How do you find that match to your company that's going to support you and growth rather than hinder you because it's making you competitive? So I think there's so much work to be done there and so much that we could improve upon to empower people rather than make them competitive against one another, which I think is the wrong avenue.
You mentioned Chelan, and of course, full transparency. I'm aware of some of the progress and some of the interactions over the years, hearing them both from you and from Chelan over time. And just sharing one of my situations, because we've been talking about vulnerability in this and talking about workplace settings. And I can recall one where it was a very small company. So you weren't hidden in the masses. And I was in a director level role. And my boss was a co-owner of the company. And and nothing wrong with this, but he was a very, very type A personality. He was former military. He was very strident in his approach to things. He could be extraordinarily intimidating and explosive at times. And so I worked somewhat in fear of how he might react to certain things. And we had gone through a process where they had this outside expert come in and conduct both interviews, and then we all took a Myers-Briggs assessment of our personalities and kind of where we fit in and how we fit in to the organization, how our personalities and skill sets and other things fit in. And then he came back, sat down with each of us. So I sat down in the office with my boss and this outside consultant, and to kind of walk through that and how my personality worked. And my boss, not surprisingly to me, said, yeah, because I was the only one of the directors that didn't fall into the categories of being very assertive and very top down in terms of how I dealt with my staff. And my boss said to me, and he didn't say it with any rancor, he said it almost just casually. He said, yeah, he said, you definitely are different. I've never even seen you yell at your staff, at a member of your staff. And kind of implying that somehow because I wasn't like he was, that I wasn't capable. He made a couple of other comments. And I went home, I stewed about that all evening. And I stewed about it all night. And I told Carol, I said, I have to go talk to him about this. I need to address this with him. And I'm going to go in tomorrow morning. He was always at the office very early. He was a workaholic as well, and expected everyone else to have that same attitude. Why didn't his staff work as hard and as many hours and with as much dedication as he did? Of course, he'd gone through 3 marriages. His kids were alienated from him. But I thought, I'm going to get there early before anybody else gets there. I'm going to get there before him. And as soon as I hear him go into his office, I'm going to go in. And I told Carol, I said, I'm either going to be in a much better position with him, or I'm going to be packing up my stuff and coming home very early tomorrow and be done with this job. And I went in, but you also, I think in addressing these things, you have to communicate things from the perspective of both transparency and honesty, but also professionalism. Going in and just starting to rant or vent at people is often a formula for just shutting down the conversation very quickly. I went in, I hadn't practiced or scripted it, but I thought about what I wanted to say. And when I said, I need to talk to you, and I shut the door, and he was like, oh, well, okay, what's this about? And I recapped what the conversation had been yesterday, re-quoted him on a few of the things he said. And I told him, I said, that's never going to be me. And if that's what you're looking for, I am not the person for this role. And I said, and I went so far as to say, to address some of the things that I observed in his behavior, even with other directors, where they would get into these shouting contests in our executive meetings. And then they'd get done just screaming at each other. I remember when I first started working there, I was expecting to get up and start exchanging blows. And they would get done just yelling at each other and screaming. And then they'd finish, and it would be like they both go, oh, that was fun. That was good. And it just left me always feeling like I was just drained. And I told him, I addressed some of the specific behaviors that I'd seen by him and by others. And I said, I, in fact, do not see that as constructive. I see it at times as dysfunctional. And I'm not going to engage in that kind of behavior. And this is the way that I choose to manage. And if that's not a good fit, I need you to let me know. He listened very casually to all of it. He didn't interrupt me. He didn't take on a defensive body language. When I got finished, he nodded and he said, thank you for coming in and sharing that with me. You're right. And we do need a diversity in the styles that we work with. And I do appreciate having you here. From that moment on through the remainder of my employment there, my relationship with him was different. It was better. It was more direct. It was more give and take on both sides.
And I think that showcases that piece. A couple of things you said there, and Chelan's probably laughing in the background a bit, because one of the things I always say is do not enter a conversation with emotion. It is not worth it. You are going to put yourself into a situation where now you're part of the problem, and some of that blame comes back splattering on you. So kudos for that part. But the other thing that you really bring up is the power of calling a behavior, and that's that accountability. It is so instrumental, and we are so fearful of it because I don't know why, because of the potential of losing a job, right? There could be a million reasons for different people, different circumstances.
Hurting a relationship in some way. Yeah.
I might hurt someone's feelings, right? Yeah. And my answer is, you can't expect somebody to know where you stand if you're not willing to voice where you stand. And, I talk a lot about two sides to every coin. So there is, you're talking two very interesting personalities. And on the one hand, we have the more collaborative, quiet, lead with a different approach than the loud, boisterous, right? I won't tell you either one of them is wrong. I will tell you that both of them have their time and their place. There are plenty of times that I have had to step up and step into that power and strength. For me, that doesn't have to involve yelling, right? I'm not a yeller. It's actually probably more terrifying when I'm quiet. But that personality has a time, a place, and a purpose.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that we expect everybody to operate that same way. And I think he hit the nail on the head with the fact of we need that diversity. We need that person that can step toe to toe. And when I get pushback, which I do in numerous occasions, when I get pushback, my capacity to stand like that brick wall and shield my team, that's powerful.
Yeah.
But you hit two personality types that I think is warranted as consideration. We talk about this all the time. I call it silent but deadly versus loud and boisterous, right? Silent but deadly is actually more dangerous, in my opinion.
Yes.
Silent but deadly often leads to resentment, frustration, negativity, heartburn for yourself, so many things. And it's a very destructive. It seems complacent, it seems compliant, it seems agreeable. And so people don't know until we hear or we ask. And that still is ownership on his part. He should have asked or been able to read the room. Maybe emotional intelligence wasn't a strength, right? I give him kudos for that. He had his strengths, he had his weaknesses.
Mm-hmm.
All of that's fine. On the other hand, I've been the stronger personality. And I will tell you, my perspective is it's taken for granted. It's leaned into when it's needed. It's used when it's appropriate. It's expected to shield when someone doesn't feel safe.
Right.
But it is the quickest to be critiqued when it's too harsh or when it's not kind. And I think that is such a hard balance to strike. But from a perfectionism standpoint, right, there is neither one of you in the wrong here.
Right.
Not in any individual state, right? Both of them might have had a wrong in a moment, but it's adapting to the larger whole. It's being able, and he having the strength of himself to be able to say, you know what? I respect who you are and how you're going to come to the table and how you're going to lead. That's not necessarily going to change how he leads. He's probably still going to have some of those strengths. But how do you give that confidence and identity to everybody so that no matter which personality, no matter which trait, no matter which conflict style, that's a fun one, no matter which conflict style you bring to the table, you're valuable and you bring value to that and you recognize who to lean to for the moments of strength.
In just the last handful of minutes that we have remaining, Lisa, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts. So somebody's coming into this conversation, they're watching today, or let's say it's me and I'm going, wow, I'm still fighting that battle. I still feel like I'm caught in that cycle. I'm in that trap of perfectionism. What are some resources that you know of, or just some basic steps, advice that you give people as a starting point to break that chain?
Yeah. So the first thing I would do is you need to do a self-assessment, and that can be done in so many different ways. It doesn't have to be a formal take a Myers-Briggs, right? But know you. If you don't know you, your ability to adapt to everything else surrounding you, you're allowing the world to control you. So I say it from a frame of take your power back. My power is knowing myself, my shortcomings and my strengths, and being able to own those. So really sit down and do a self-assessment. When you really think about the times that you are so stuck in the rut and you are not able to move beyond that perfectionism, self-assess, analyze. Why are you there? What's driving this? And that will give you such a wealth of knowledge, right? That's step one, because if you can take that to a person you trust that can help you start resolving that, that's going to be powerful. The second piece that I would recommend is that piece of shifting to success, right? Driven by a journey as opposed to a destination or an outcome. If you look backwards, so most of the time when I see somebody really get stuck in a perfectionism moment, it's because they're looking at what's ahead of them as the mountain, right? Stop, pause, turn around. If you actually look at how far you've come, it really opens your eyes from a whole different world. And what it does is it level sets you. It gives you that ability to say, you know what? I have come so far. And before I allow this to defeat me and to become the defining moment in my world at this particular moment, I'm going to recognize how much I've already done. And the last piece that I would say is with regards to perfectionism specifically, if you can step back and be able to take that power, right? Building on the first two, take that power back, look at where you've already come, put your shoe on the other foot. We have all been on the receiving end of someone who didn't want to hand somebody something, didn't want to collaborate with somebody, didn't want to get feedback. The further you bury yourself in your perfectionism, the less flexible, the less willing you are to take that insight from someone else. We are so invested in the outcome at this point. We are so invested in the project at this point. We're no longer able to say, that's a great idea. So it really does kill collaboration from the get-go. It makes you much more rigid. You're not going to be as successful or as open to feedback. Remember what that feels like when someone does it to you. Because when we can look at what it feels like for us, it really can help us adjust how we're operating.
Very good. Well, Lisa, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Thank you for sharing the excellence of your perspective on this and just helping us understand the importance of continuing to focus on things like balance and progress and growth, as opposed to some outcome that is always going to be something of a moving target and sometimes so esoteric that we don't even really know where the bullseye is on that. But I appreciate it. It's been a useful conversation for me, and I have no doubt that it has been very helpful for others. So good luck as you finish up your doctorate, and wish you the best until the next time that you join us with another interesting and fun topic.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me.
All right. Once again, I have yet to have a conversation with Lisa. One of the reasons that I actually love having her join us live as opposed to pre-recording is the spontaneity of this and the difference that it makes. And thank you for allowing us to go a little bit longer than usual today with this. I do want to share some things that are coming up in the next handful of weeks on Coffee Breaks, and just let you know that we've got kind of a double thing coming up here. You may recall we talked about this a little bit last week, that Shalane had something of I wouldn't say a surprise topic, but she had approached me about wanting to have a conversation about my childhood, and she didn't give me a lot of detail. And we have been preparing that conversation in a pre-recording, and there was so much to it. Hopefully it's going to be as interesting to viewers as it was for Shalane and I to talk about it, because even though I've always been open about sharing things about my childhood, there were things that came up in the conversation that Shalane didn't know. But there was so much meat to it that even in editing it down, we felt like it made sense to break it up. So that conversation is going to be split up between two episodes. Next week on the 28th and the following week on July 5th will be parts 1 and 2 of Shalane approaching me to reflect on Steve's childhood revisited. And then going to July 12th, we're going to be having on the show a gentleman who is pretty amazing. He works in the financial industry. And with that, he has a company that invests in and produces live theater, including some key Broadway shows that he's currently invested in. He has worked as a producer on multiple shows, and we're going to be talking to him about that. What does it mean to be a producer in a show? And why does he feel that's an important element in terms of promoting the arts? So Ananth Das will be with us on July 12th. What are the topics that you would like to discuss? Who are the guests you'd like to see here on Coffee Breaks with Steve? It's your conversation too. So please email us at cbwsteve@comcast.net with your ideas, with your, if you know somebody that you think would be a fantastic guest here, then you maybe are willing to make an introduction and get us connected so that we can follow up and make sure that we can arrange to have them on here. We do have some people that are in the works, and we're getting them scheduled for upcoming shows, but we want your input on that as well. So please do let us know. Actually, this is not completely up to date because today was the 276th episode of Coffee Breaks. 144 of those have been with guests. 97 individual guests who joined us. Some of them, like Lisa, have been back here more than once. And we're proud of that track record. We're also humbled by it because it does mean that people are willing to take the time and invest in sharing their expertise, in sharing what they have to offer. And that is a really cool thing. It's also, for us, very humbling and important that you are here. You are part of this conversation. You join us around our virtual coffee table each week. And while we do this live on Facebook, but primarily in terms of the chat and the conversation, you may or may not be aware that we also have a YouTube channel. And we encourage people to subscribe to that channel, to go on and check out our videos there, to like them, to maybe even tap the bell in there so that you get alerts when a new video is up. And the other thing we would ask you to do is that if you are not yet a subscriber, yes, please subscribe. If you are a subscriber, would you share the YouTube channel with others in your circle, in your network, in your friend base, whatever it might be, and let people know about this? How many people do you think, on the outside of those who might join live during this live stream, how many people do you know who could gain a lot of confidence, of wisdom, of knowledge, of direction forward if they had had the opportunity, or if they have the opportunity, to go back and watch this conversation with Lisa Steele? And we have so many great guests on this show, so many interesting topics. Would you please help get our YouTube channel out there in front of people so that we get even more of those listening, watching, communicating with us, being part of that conversation as we go forward. All right, listen, we have gone even a little bit over the 1 hour mark. And so I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for staying with us. Thank you once again to Lisa for taking the time, and one of my favorite conversations of the last several months, because it is relevant to things that I've dealt with, things that I'm trying to help some people around me walk through right now. But we all know that we have the ability to do things, to say things, to act in a way that can be helpful to others. So please find a way to make a difference in your world this week. God bless you. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Coffee Breaks with